So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce Mr. Stephen Andrasko, and he will teach you to say extravaganza. I can't put in an accent. Visitors in the night, Pascagoula UFO. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Stephen Andrasko.
Well, thank you. We're going to talk about a very interesting case that happened 40 years ago in October, on October the 11th, 1973, to two men that were out fishing. They were fishing on a river. They weren't having much luck, so they decided to move closer to the shipyards and fish off the dock. And when they did, something extraordinary happened to them. After their experience, they, of course, were very shook up about what happened, and they decided they had better tell someone. So they called the sheriff, and Sheriff Diamond told him to come in, and so they did. They interviewed them, and then the sheriff and his assistant, they decided to leave the two alone with a tape recorder running to see if what they were telling them was, truth, or if it was something they had made up. And so they left the tape recorders running, and this is the transcript of what the two had to say.
Can you forward the slide, please?
Oh, I guess I'd better do that. Okay.
Well, in October, I was working at a small shipyard in Pascagoula, and Calvin Parker was working for me, a shipyard. And sometime during the day, we decided to go fishing in the evening, which I'd done many times afterwards. So when we got to the river, the Pascagoula River, it began to get late and fish weren't biting. So we were going to try one more place by the old Shawfield shipyard. That's where this thing happened at. And we were sitting out at the pier, fishing out into the river. And I think maybe I was reeling in. I don't remember there. But I heard some hissing sound behind. And I raised up on, we were sitting down on the pier. I stood up and looked around. And there was something back there that was holding about that far from the ground, probably 40 foot long. Now, I don't know whether it was round or whether it was oblong because the way I was looking at it. But I know up toward what I'm assuming to be the front, there was something like two lights, pulsating lights. They were blue. And it really frightened me. I didn't know what it was. And by this time, Calvin, he had come up on his feet, and we just instantly had a door appeared at that crack, and brilliant light from outside to where we were. And there were three things came through that doorway. Turn that book over on the back and see what they look like. That's primarily what they look like. Yeah. They were very wrinkled, and I didn't see the eyes. And I know now, I didn't know then, I know now they were robots. But anyhow, they came around to the side of me, and one took hold of his shoulder, and I felt pain there, just instantly pain. Another one took hold of his shoulder, and I just went limp. And they weren't touching the ground. The light was off the ground. They were just gliding out the world. Meditating. And I seemed to just, when they took hold of me, I just raised up to the height they were. And we was in that beam of light, and they was taking me toward the ship, and I noticed Calvin at this time. And when one took a hold of him, he fainted.
Okay, this interview was done about 15 years after their experience, and he talks about when they saw the ship, the two of them were very frightened. The ship hovered there and a door opened out of nowhere, and these three occupants or creatures came out of the spaceship, grabbed a hold of the two of them. Now Charles is much older. He was about 20-some years older than Calvin. And Calvin was actually a friend of Charles' son, and they worked together in the shipyard. He had been a Korean War veteran, had been in battlefield experiences, and so he wasn't quite as frightened as Calvin was, who was 19 years old at the time. Calvin rarely did any interviews. This interview was done 10 years after the incident, and this is the explanation of what happened to him at the same time.
I was fishing in Pascagoula, Mississippi in October 11th of 1973 when I heard a noise behind me. I turned to look at the noise. There was blue hazy lights. I noticed the lights getting closer and closer. They were probably 150 foot away. Then they stopped. Probably a foot and a half off the ground. I noticed the door open on a craft. 3 robot-looking beings was coming out of this craft toward me. I looked at each side. I wanted to run. I had nowhere to run. I couldn't swim at the time, so I didn't want to take a chance of jumping into the water and drowning. So these beings were approaching me, and I was fishing with a friend, and I turned and looked, and he just looked amazed like I did. And when they come up, one of them injected something into my arm, and my body went totally numb. I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't move anything. My muscles were paralyzed. So this being left, and he went over to the friend that I was fishing with and injected something into him, and this was the last that I seen of him until I left the craft. Another being came from behind and picked me up. They floated me to the ship. They picked me up probably a foot and a half off the ground by one arm, on my left arm, and then they just kind of glided or floated us into the ship.
Okay, both had generally the same experience. These odd-looking creatures were not human-looking. When they described them, about 5 feet tall, they didn't really have what you would call legs. They had a eerie, silvery, elephant-looking like skin and weird protrusions where you call like a nose or ears. They had claw-like hands, and they grabbed a hold of them, and when they did, they went numb. And then these creatures just floated them into the spacecraft. They didn't seem to walk or fly. They just seemed to levitate off the ground and floated them into the ship. And once they got on board the ship, they didn't see each other again. But 2 kind of completely different things happened to them while they were aboard the ship. Okay. No.
Anyhow, they carried on into that craft, and inside it was a round compartment or a room. And it was very blue, like the light was coming out from the wall, the overhead, and the floor. And we stopped, they stopped me, it seemed like in the middle of the room. And they just left me, but I wasn't touching anything. The laying position. And I could tell that I couldn't move anything with my eyes. I could move my eyes. I could tell that they had left me. And something in the wall in front of me, it came out of that light in that wall and moved up in front of me about this far. It was probably this big around, and it appeared to me like a big eye. But there was something in there, it was some kind of instrument. I can't describe what it was. But anyhow, this thing remained there for a few seconds or minutes. And it went down. And of course I'm having to assume it went under me and came back up my backside, because after a while it moved back up in front of me again.
Like scanned you or something.
And that's what it was. And it stayed there a few minutes, and then went back into that wall and disappeared. And I didn't know what to think of. I was terrified. But I couldn't say anything. And I don't know how long I was in there.
Okay, so Charles was taken aboard the ship. He was paralyzed. He was in a room that was brightly lit, and out of the light came this football-sized object that looked like a giant eye, he describes. I mean, it's mechanical or or what, and this eye came in front of him and seemed to scan him up and down, went behind him, scanned him, and came back around and scanned him again. So he was staring into this giant eyeball-looking thing that was staring right at him, and he could not speak, he could not move, he could only move his eyes. So he was very frightened, and then the object disappeared again into the bright lights. Calvin's experience, though, was much different and left a much more terrifying mark on Calvin.
I noticed the door open on a craft. 3 robot-looking beings was coming out of this craft toward me. I looked to each side. I wanted to run. I had nowhere to run. I couldn't swim at the time, so I didn't want to take a chance of jumping into the water and drowning. So these beings were approaching me, and I was fishing with a friend, and I turned and looked, and he just looked amazed like I did. And when they come up, one of them injected something into my arm, and my body went totally numb. I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't move anything. My muscles were paralyzed. So this being left, and he went over to the friend that I was fishing with and injected something into him. And this was the last that I seen of him until I left the craft. Another being came from behind and picked me up. They floated me to the ship. They picked me up probably 1.5 feet off the ground by one arm, on my left arm. And then they just kind of glided or floated us into the ship. They took me into the craft, and they took me off into a hallway into the left. And they kind of guided me down this hallway, and I noticed my legs wasn't moving, or my eyes wasn't moving, or my hands, or my feet. I couldn't move anything about me. And they took me into an examination room, and they left me on a table, probably at a 45-degree angle. And they turned around and they left and went out the door. And as they left the door, I heard a noise, kind of like the air brakes on a truck. And they left me laying on this table at a 45-degree angle. I really wasn't scared then, because I guess I was drugged in some way. But little did I know what was fixing to happen. I was able to move my eyes, so I looked toward the back and another door, and I tried to look around to see what all was in here. And I noticed something that came through the door that was even stranger than what had picked me up. I noticed a small, petite-looking being of some kind, and at the time I didn't know if it was male or female or if it was harmful or what. It came in and lifted my gum. And she lifted my gum up and she injected some kind of needle into my gum. And I noticed I had on a white t-shirt that night. And I noticed out of on this white t-shirt the blood that was rolling from my gum down. All I could do was just kind of move my eyes and look down to this t-shirt. I didn't feel any pain then. And then she went down to my shoes, and she tried to get my shoes off. And I noticed that she was trying to take my shoes off from her toe, and she kept working on them, trying to get them off. And she was really getting impatient then. So she tried to get my shoes off, and unable to get both of them off, but she did get one of them off. And she reached and she pulled my pants down, almost to the knees. And back then I didn't wear underwear. And all I had on was a white t-shirt and a pair of blue jeans and a pair of loafers that I walked around in. And she injected some kind of needle or something under my penis. She lifted it up and she injected this needle under the underside of my penis. And she pulled it out. And then, still not feeling no pain, she turned around and she walked out the door. And I thought, God, this is over with. Maybe I might have a chance to live through this or to get out. But I was really feeling violated now. So she left the room with this needle and things. And immediately after she left the room, when the door closed behind her, I was able to stand up. So I put my other shoe on. I automatically pulled my pants up. And I noticed a quiver going all over my body, and I was shaking. And I don't know if this was from fear or being too cold. And I noticed my lights, and for the first time I noticed how bright the lights were on the inside of this craft of some kind. And I was able to look around, and I was able to examine it for a little bit. And I noticed a mirror or a window of some kind all the way to the back wall with some kind of little brassy looking balls around this mural. It resembled brass of some kind.
Well, Calvin's experience was much more frightening, and he did not see the giant eye that came and scanned Charles, but they pulled up his lip and injected a needle into his gums, and then did the same thing in his genital areas. Now, my wife says, make sure before you're abducted that you have on clean underwear. That's what my wife told me. So I make sure when I leave the house every morning I'm wearing clean underwear, because Calvin was going commando in those days. But when they came back, he felt very frightened, and of course, looking around to see, try to observe and notice the environment that he was in. But they weren't left there for very long.
After a while, these things, they came back, moved up to me. I could tell by, my eyes were shining. He took hold of me. We turned around, and he carried me through that main lot back where I was and put me down. They didn't throw me down, they leave me down. I don't think they were trying to harm us anyway. But I couldn't, and I didn't know for a long time later on under hypnosis, I found out that there was a woman in that room there where this eye came out. And this is probably even hard for me. They were something like living beings, looked almost like us. I could see through that window. I didn't know that for a long time. Something it was in my subconscious mind. And but they looked almost like we did. And what they were doing, evidently, they couldn't live in our atmosphere, I don't suppose. And they had these robots to examine them. We didn't distract their attention one way or the other, seemed they had something to do. And I tried to talk to them, I couldn't hear them. I said, you can hear yourself talk. I couldn't even talk. And they know, I guess, what they were supposed to do. And when they came out there and let me down, I saw Calvin. And he was standing on the bench of that river with his arm out straight like that.
Okay, so Charles, while he was aboard the ship, he never saw any creatures other than the robot-like creatures that abducted him. Later, under hypnosis, he was able to describe that there were some windows with some more human-like creatures behind them that were observing what was happening to him when he was being scanned. These robot-like creatures came again, took him and Calvin back off the ship and left them not far from where they were fishing. Okay.
And then I heard the door, and it sounded like the brakes on a truck when you put them on. And she walked into the room, and this time she didn't have a mask, and I was looking eye to eye with what I thought was a person or the being that was going to kill me. So when I looked into her eyes, I noticed her eyes were slightly larger than what our eyes were, and they was brown in color. And then I did see a nose on her, and I did see what resembled a mouth on her. And I thought then that she must have had on some kind of mask. And it really hadn't dawned on me then that this being had feelings too and all, until a little later on. So I said, I've got to leave here. I've got to bring back some kind of physical proof that this happened. I just can't go out and let this lay like this and bring back nothing from this crowd. So I reached like I was going to grab her, and I was much bigger than what she was, so I felt like I could go ahead and take her, not thinking of endangering myself with the robots that had picked us up from the outside. So when I reached to grab her, immediately I became paralyzed again. And she backed me up against the wall, and she sat there and she started staring at me. And as she was staring at me, it seemed like my whole life came up on a movie projector or a screen. And I started looking at everything that was important to me. I started seeing birthdays as I was a child, even from as early as 1 year old on up. I started seeing deaths that I had experienced in family deaths, and just different things. So it seemed like my whole life was just flashing before me. So she backed off then, and I was wondering, I tried to speak to her, and I couldn't speak, and I couldn't move. And then she said, from my mind to her mind, like in mental telepathy, and I could hear her voice today. It was just a real soft-spoken, easy voice. And I could hear her, and she would tell me, look, you're here for a reason. You might not know this reason, but we have taken you for a reason. And unlike everyone else that's had different experiences where they say, I mean you no harm, I really felt some kind of harm that was coming. I didn't feel like, it might not be from the violations that she had done that night, but I felt like a deeper harm was coming to the world. So she had me aboard, and she was probing my mind and all. And I was sitting, and all I could do was sit patiently and look. And then she turned and she walked out the door. And as she walked out the door, immediately as she left, I felt the wind from somewhere come, and another door had opened. And these three creatures, I turned and I looked, and I seen these three creatures standing inside the door. So one of them came in, and they got me by the arm, and automatically I was paralyzed again. So as I was paralyzed, they turned and they started walking me outside the craft, and I started kind of looking around with my eyes. I didn't move my head or anything, but my eyes, I couldn't move through this whole deal. And I noticed it was real bright lights, and they were so bright that when we walked outside, I really couldn't notice or see anything. So they floated me back out, probably a foot and a half again, off the ground to the original place where they had picked me up. Now a lot of people say, well, they picked you up over the water, but that's not so. It was 150 foot or 125 to 150 foot back on the land where they had abducted us. And they set me out just before the clear on the water. My arms was outstretched across the water. And this is the first time that I really felt a lot of fear. My knees got real weak, and I kind of just dipped down because I couldn't control myself. And I looked and I noticed a friend standing behind me that had been through a similar experience that I had, not knowing what he had been through.
So after his medical experiments, he had what commonly happens to people that have near-death experiences or in traumatic accidents. He saw his life flashing before him, and he thought that he wasn't going to be around much longer. He was very frightened that something terrible was about to happen. And so the two of them were left out where they had been fishing, and the spaceship, or the craft, left. They didn't really see it leave, they heard it leave, but because of the brightness of being inside the ship, and then when they were put back outside, it was dark. They really didn't get to see as the ship departed. Now after that, Calvin was very hysterical, and Charles went to his pickup truck and got out a bottle of whiskey and had a few shots to calm his nerves, and tried to get Calvin to do the same. And then they talked to see what they should do, and they decided they needed to tell someone. So this is where they went to see the sheriff. After they were interviewed by the sheriff, again, like I said, they left a tape recorder running to try and see maybe if these, when the two guys, when they were alone, they would say something that would incriminate them. But this is what the tape recorder recorded him saying: "I can't take much more of that. Calvin, I gotta get home and get to bed and get some nerve pills or see the doctor or something. I can't stand it. I'm about to go half crazy. I tell you, when we're through, I'll get you something to settle down so you can get some damn sleep. I can't sleep yet. I can't sleep like it is. I'm damn near crazy." Well, Calvin, when they brought you out, and they brought me out of that thing, I never in the hell got you straightened out. My arms, I remember they just froze up. I couldn't move. It's like I stepped on a damn rattlesnake. They didn't do me that way," said Charlie. I passed out. I expect I never passed out in my whole life. I've never seen nothing like that in my life. You can't make people believe. I don't want to keep sitting here. I want to see a doctor. They'd better wake up and start believing. they better start believing. You know how that damn door came right up? I don't know how it opened, son. I don't know. It just laid up there like that, and those SOBs came out. That's where they came out. I know you can't believe it, and you can't make people believe it. I paralyzed right then. I couldn't move. They won't believe it. They're gonna have to believe it one of these days. It might be too late. I knew all along there was people from other worlds up there. I knew all along, but I never thought it would happen to me. You know I don't drink, said Calvin. I know that, son. But when we get to the house, I'm going to have another drink that make me sleep. Look, what are we sitting around for? I got to go home and tell Blanche. What are we waiting for? I got to go. I'm getting sick. I got to get out of here. When Charles left the room and left Calvin alone, it's hard to believe, he said. Oh, God, it's so awful. I know there's a God up there. And then he began to pray. Now, when the sheriffs ran the tape that they had, they were pretty certain now that these two had undergone a pretty traumatic experience. And so they suggested that they go to the Air Force base and talk to the Air Force. The Air Force told them that they really weren't doing those kind of interviews anymore, but they did agree to check them to see if they had been exposed to any radiation or that sort of thing, to make sure that they weren't having ill side effects.
And when I couldn't get up, my leg was still weak, and I was trying to make my way toward him to see if I could hit him, and I managed to get up on my feet before I got to him, and I couldn't get him to say anything, just like he was out of it. I shook him, and I even had to slap him to get him where I could talk to him. And I told him, he was screaming, what did they do to us? I tried to assure him that they didn't, I don't think they done any physical harm, and they had gone. When I got him back where I could talk with him, and we didn't know what to do. I didn't want to tell anybody, they called us crazy and nuts, They think it's just not supposed to happen. But anyway, we talked about it again. Before we got home, we decided that we'd call the sheriff's department and notify them it might be a threat to our country, is what I was thinking about. And I could tell they thought we was pulling his leg. Anyhow, they sent 2 deputies over there, we were, and asked us to follow them to the station. So we followed them to the sheriff's department. And they kept us in there, I don't know how long. They had 8 in one room and me in one room. And then later on, they brought Calvin back in the room with me, and they went out to do something. We didn't know it at that time, but they had a hidden tape recorder. And I think that the copy of that tape, I think, what really finally convinced them that something had happened to us. So Fred Dunham was the sheriff. He's deceased now, and I made him promise me that they wouldn't, there'd be no publicity about it. Just try to find out. Get it to the proper party to it, they worry. We won't be any publicity about it now. So we left there that assured that there wouldn't be any publicity. And we got home and it was almost daylight then. And I had a responsibility to shipyard. I was a foreman there. And I told my wife, I was I'm going to work. And we got over there to the shipyard, and I got my people all working in my office and the telephone line. And it was Fred Dunn. Now, the first one I heard, it was from some news reporter in Jackson. And it was asking me what had happened to Calvin and me the night before. Well, I just hung up on him. I didn't know, how did they find it out there? But then the telephone rang again with Fred Dunn, the sheriff. And I said some bad words to him and told him that the news reporter had been trying to contact him. He said, I don't know, try to get out by this all, but it got slipped out somewhere. So, by that time, that day, it was all over the world. My oldest son he was in the Marine Corps, but he was in Vietnam, but he was in Okinawa at that time. And they had the next day, and that sergeant got papers to get over. So anyhow, we went down to the shipyard, and I couldn't work. So news me you would believe was coming to the shipyard. So somehow the word got to Dr. Adam Hank and Dr. Jim Harder from Berkeley, and Dr. Adam Hank out of Chicago. They came down here the next day. And when we called us, the hip day. So meanwhile, let me get a little bit ahead of the story. Meanwhile, that day we were down there, and I got to thinking, what if we had radiation? You know, I've been from my family, run things, so I brought that up. They took us over to the San Diego Hospital, and they didn't have the facilities to check us for radiation, but they called Keith Air Force Base, and they told us to go to bring us over there. So we got over there, we had an escort there waiting on at the gate, and they had cleared the entire area. We couldn't see anybody. And we went to a conference room, and that's where this right here, they inherited it's infectious for radiation. And they thought it found the radiation on cabin, I guess it did. But anyhow, we came back, and it was the next day that Dr. Van and Dr. Harder came down, and they put me under hypnosis and Calvin, and they come to the conclusion that something had happened to us. Well, you wouldn't believe it, the madhouse here concluded that we couldn't sleep, we couldn't eat, and every time that we looked somebody come to interview us, you know, and then a little bit later on, they wanted to take a polygraph test. So I got off work that evening, and we went on to the sheriff's department. They had a polygraph examiner there, and when he put me back in the room, he told me, said, "Look, this is he was going to prove me to lie." He said, "Now, if you want to go out, I'll go out there and tell them that it just wouldn't work if you don't take this polygraph test." I said, "Man, I'm fine, get out of it. Let me get home. Give me to that." So when he got through, how could you give me toothpaste? And Fred Diamond, the sheriff, said when he got to him around the outside, he said, "That man is telling the damn truth in there."
So afterwards, when they got home, they couldn't sleep, they decided to go to work. And when Charles got to work, he was a foreman there at the shipyard. He went into his office, and his boss said, "There's reporters calling. There's reporters here that want to talk to you." Well, it had only been a few hours since he had talked to the sheriff. So he was very upset because the sheriff had promised they wouldn't tell anybody. Of course, the sheriff called and said, "I don't know how it got out, but it did." And so from that time forward, Charles was bombarded with reporters from all over the world. Some UFO researchers came to talk with him. He took some lie detector tests. They took radiation tests to make sure they weren't exposed to radiation. They went under hypnosis, and this is where Charles remembered some of the other things that he did not remember after their experience. Calvin, on the other hand, he had much more problems. He was in the hospital for a while. You could say maybe he had like post-traumatic stress syndrome type symptoms. And he kind of became a recluse and did not talk about it much after that. Charles went on to be on many television shows. He wrote a book before he died. And before he died, he said, "I tell you here and now, and God is my witness, and I believe in God, that when I die, I'll tell everybody what I saw, and it will be the same story." Well, Charles, he has passed on, and last October marked the 40th anniversary of the event, and And Calvin, he did agree to be interviewed by the local media there in Pascagoula. He had moved around the country from place to place, doing mostly construction and oil field type jobs, and now he's moved back. He's had a stroke, and but he still sticks to his story. He took the reporter back to the spot where they were fishing and describes that he still likes to go fishing in the area from time to time. Finishing up, he says, "I'm a firm believer in God, and when there's good, where there's good, there is also the bad." And so he still has not, I would say, recovered and come to terms completely with what happened to them 40 years ago. And we're hoping, Noe and I were hoping to have a book more with more details and things about what happened to Calvin after this event, because he really hasn't talked about it that much since that time. You can go on the internet and look up Pascagoula UFO case, and there's much information there for you. And I hope that this case will give you some interest in other cases that Noe, especially the one Noe and Ruben are going to talk about, that happened right in this area, not too far from where we're sitting today. Okay. And I thank you all for coming this afternoon. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
We're going to have a 10-minute break, and then in 10 minutes, Ruben Urieta and I will talk about how we discovered about a UFO that supposedly crashed just north of here, where we're sitting today, the Del Rio UFO crash, in 10 minutes. Thank you.